If you've ever started or wanted to build a Stratocaster body, stay with me. This is the third part of this guide, and we already have a body blank cut to the correct shape. There's more than one way to go about this, and I'll try and show them going step by step and using less than professional tools. So stick around. Let's build a Stratocaster body. Hi, I'm Yoav and this is the Electric Luthier. In the last part, we took the templates we created for the body, cut the outlines and routed them. I link it above if you've missed it. Today, we'll get into the routing of the cavities and the shaping and rounding of it all. We'll try and cover multiple ways and tools to achieve it. Going right back to our templates, we'll start with the front side and attach it using our favorite method, be it double-sided tape or with masking tape and super glue. You can also just use clamps and attach it to the table. You will have to work around the clamps, but with smaller routers, that might actually be the easiest way to go about it. The best way to remove the biggest amount of material and make the router job easier is with a Forstner drill bit. Aside from the ability to extract drilled chips and avoid clogging, these also have a relatively shallow tip in the middle. They also make a much cleaner cut, especially compared to the butterfly tips. I have a 22mm bit with an adjustable stopper, so I set it to just a bit under the desired depth, taking the thickness of the template into account and starting drilling away. Before we start removing any material, we need to take a good look at the depth we're going to be drilling and routing. Starting at the neck pocket, most fender necks are 5/8 of an inch, which is 16mm. When it comes to the pickups, you should be aware of the difference between the shallower 5/8 or 16mm vintage pickups and compare it with the 3/4 or 19mm in standard strats. The main thing to look out for is that you don't go too deep and accidentally hit the back cavity for the tremolo springs, which is also 5/8 of an inch or 16mm. This may be an issue if you go too deep on either side and if your overall thickness is less than the standard 1 3/4 inches or 45.5mm. If you are routing for vintage pickups, you should still be aware of the wiring channels depth. The tremolo bridge routing is also a bit tricky and needs routing from both front and back, although it is possible to route from the back exclusively. The tricky parts are the wider route from the back, which leaves room for the tremolo motion, and the thinner one at the front for just putting it in. The little 0.2 inches or 5mm shelf left for the bridge to rest on the cover also needs to be carefully measured and aligned between the front and the back templates. The 1.5 inch or 38mm cavity depth shouldn't really be a problem if your overall thickness is right. Again, it depends on your hardware as well. Now, my 22mm bit is just perfect for the single coil cavities, but I generally like leaving a hairline for the router to remove. It just makes everything a bit smoother at the end. Of course, a large enough drill press with a depth stop would be the perfect tool for this job. But since the final pass with the router should smooth it all out, a hand drill should be fine as well. After the pickups are done, I adjust the depth for the deeper cavity. Next, I'll switch to a smaller radius wood drill bit, something like 10mm in this case, and drill the bridge cavity and all the other places where the 22mm was too large to get into or left large enough chunks that I can drill. I don't have a limiter here, so I mark it with a piece of tape on the right depth. It's always better to drill too little and not too much. The pre-drilling is now done, and I set the router with a flush trim bit of the appropriate depth. If the bit you have is too short, you can do it in 2 passes, just like we did the outline. If it's a bit too long, a thick template may give you enough height to work with. I start from the neck pocket and work my way to the pickups and then the cavities. The key here is short, slow, and deliberate motion. I always try to cut against the direction of the blade, which works out to be clockwise. A small plunge router is ideal for this job in my opinion, and since I don't have one, I do the manual diagonal plunge. I hold one edge of the router plate firmly down and carefully lower the other end and the blade into the pre-drilled hole. You really want to avoid touching any of the sides when plunging in like this. If this is your first stab at this, try it on some scrap wood first. You can easily damage the template or the body with a bad entry. After I've routed all I can to 5/8 or 16mm, including the control cavity, I'll switch to a smaller radius flush trim bit for all the smaller corners as well as the connecting channel between the pickups and the bridge cavity. My smaller bits also have a 1/4 inch shaft, so it's easier for me to switch to the smaller trimmer router. If I had a choice, and in this case I do, I'll do most of the heavy duty routing with a larger and stronger router and then switch to a lighter one for the smaller details. You can still do all the work with either of these if you have the bits for it. To get the control cavity nice, round and deep, I use one of the 2 small additions which we made for the templates and insert it into the bridge pickup cavity. I adjust the depth and double check that my bearings will have something to write against. I also switch to a transparent base so I can see what I'm doing better. Last but not least, on the front side, if you're doing vintage pickups, is the wiring channel. For this small channel, I decide to just freehand it. I mark it with a pencil and have at it. At this point, you can do it with or without the template. Again, double check your depth before you start. If you want a tidier result, or if this was for a customer for instance, you can clamp some parallel edges to work with and then get a nicer and cleaner line. Before I flip it to do the backside, please take a moment and subscribe down below and also hit the bell to get notified when a new video comes out. And feel free to also check out my website, theelectricluthier.com, with loads of information on guitar building. Switching to the back, we go through much of the same process. We start with attaching the template. We follow with the wide Forstner drill bit to remove as much wood as we can. You can dig a lot deeper on the bridge side. I don't mind the wider bit here. I'll touch up on the tighter corners later. At this point, I need that second little template piece to give the router bearings an edge for the deeper cut. I will do this in 2 passes using a medium and a long bit. I plunge in to route the medium depth and then switch bits to go all the way in. You can approach the backside in a different way and start with just the deep end. My extra piece is sitting very snugly, but if it were a bit loose, I would want it to sit on the body. I'll drill and route the deeper area, again in 2 passes, Only then I'll remove the template thingy and drill the rest of the tremolo spring cavity to a little under the depth I need. Then again, route with a flush trim bit all the way to 5/8 of an inch or 16 millimeters. This will give me that larger cavity at the back and a smaller opening for the bridge at the front. The order of things here is really up to you and whatever works better with your tools and setup. We haven't touched on sanding yet, but this is the point where it starts to be critical. Before rounding the edges, we need to make sure they're smooth and bump free. Any little chip or bump will be transferred to the whole radius and make sanding a bit of a nightmare. Use whatever sanders you have or even good old manual sanding with a block to get the whole edge straight and smooth. There's no need for high grit paper yet. 100 grit will be fine at this point, and I'm talking mostly about the edge and not the surface. When it comes to rounding the edge of the Strat body, a 1/2 inch round over bit is really all you need. There were a few models with a slightly different radius, but for the vast majority, this is the only round over bit you'll need. Mine has a 1/4 inch shaft, so my first option is to mount it on the little trimmer and start running along the edge. I gave my trimmer a wider base for a better grip and more stability, but with a steady hold, you can get the same result. Make sure you're routing against the blade rotation and there is resistance to your action instead of the trimmer pulling your hand. The only area to be more careful is around the neck pocket, both in front and the back, where you'll probably need to manually handle the much smaller radius. The two sides of the neck pocket at the front side are also thin, and especially with softer woods, may require a bit more attention. Of course, you can mount the same or similar round over bit on a larger router, although this may require a 1/4 to 1/2 inch adapter. Instead of using an adapter, I should just buy one with a 1/2 inch shaft, make sure they have a tight fit, and tighten them firmly. I've had some unfortunate mishaps with such adapters when they're not tight enough. An even better option for rounding those edges, using the very same bit, is to mount the router to a table and have the added strength, stability, and comfort. You should still maintain the routing direction and push against the rotation of the blade while keeping your hands far enough from the rotating blade. I leave the tips around the neck pocket for manual sanding too. This is one of the easier and more satisfying parts, and you very quickly get a visually significant result. The last significant part is the shaping of the comfort contours. Remember that extra plan I printed before making the templates? Here it is. I marked the belly contour at the back and the armrest in the front. There are a few ways to remove all the material. The Japanese rasp saw is a favorite amongst luthiers, and I have also seen it being cut with a bandsaw, scraped, chiseled, or sanded. All methods are valid and have their pros and cons. Now, my personal favorite is the grinding wheel on the grinder. This is probably the quickest way to remove large amounts of wood, but does require a bit of practice and caution, as it can just as quickly do a lot of damage. This is another place where there's a bit of a difference between vintage and standard Strat models. The vintage models have deeper and more pronounced contours. The standard models sometimes require gluing a top or binding, so Fender decided to tone down the contours for easier construction. The very rough grinding will be followed by very rough sanding, just to even out the surface. I may start with something as low as 40 or 60 grit paper to finalize the shape and work up to about 100. And looking at all the moving around, it does seem like I need to find a better way to anchor my mat. It's holding the body just fine, but slipping on the table. Okay, time for sanding. A small orbital sander is an asset, although any method of smoothing the surface is kosher by me. I try and sand the flat surfaces with a sander, but leave the rounded edges for manual sanding. You don't want to ruin that radius with a hard grit. I try to first have the whole body sanded to 100 grit. I also give the neck pocket the final shape. Although finishing it is not in the scope of this guide, you do need to consider it at this point. I did find a few places where a bit of filler may be needed. If I was going for an opaque color, I could have used different types of filler, but I want the option of leaving it natural, so I'll be using a combination of carpenter's glue and fine wood dust. I used the dust from the sander I just used for the similar color result. However, I decide to be a bit creative and use ebony dust for the more dramatic effect in the small cracks around the knots, both in the front and the back. Of course, I leave it overnight or even a couple of days, and after the glue is firmly dried and cured, I'll scrape it and sand it. Yep, I like the dark accent here. It's not too much, and it definitely does the job. Before calling this done, there are a few holes to drill. It's always good to finish all the drilling before applying any finish, and the first will be the connection between the jack cavity and the control cavity. There are specific angles and location that can be followed, but eventually you just need to find the starting point from the jack side and aim towards the control panel. A long drill will help avoid scraping the body with the drill chuck. Next is the channel connecting the control cavity with the tremolo spring cavity. This one will be used for grounding the bridge and tremolo system. I'll be going from the back towards the controls. You may also want to pre-drill the holes for the neck screws and for the bridge. However, I will prefer to only drill those once I have all the hardware. There are many small differences between models and makes, so it's always better to verify the fit before drilling. That's pretty much it. We covered various methods and tools to make a Strat body, and I hope that at least one of them will be right for you. You now know all the steps you need to take to create a Strat body. You can of course follow the same methods for any type of variation or super Strat you like and finish it with your desired color and hardware. Use it as a replacement body, add a pre-made neck, or build it all from scratch. It's all in your hands, and we're slowly running out of excuses. I will link the plans as well as the tools I used here in the description below. If you want more content about guitar building, please hit the subscribe button below and don't forget the little bell to get notified when a new video comes out. You can get the plans and much more information on my website, theelectricluthier.com. And until next time, go on, build a guitar.